Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. Every year, ENO monitors and tracks the major transportation ballot measures in the run-up to the election, and this year is certainly not an exception. There are several major ballot measures across the country, and among those is Proposition A in Austin. If approved, this property tax measure would fund a $7 billion expansion of the city's transit system, including, but not limited to, 2 new light rail lines, a downtown transit tunnel, expanded bus service, and a new commuter rail line. Today, we'll be discussing and hearing more about Prop A with John Michael Cortez and David Couch. John Michael serves as Special Assistant to the Mayor of Austin, where he advises Mayor Adler on regional planning, transportation, workforce development, and affordable housing. Dave Couch is the Program Officer for Project Connect at Capital Metro and has over 30 years of management experience in the public transit industry. So Dave will provide an overview of the overall initial investment and system plans and share some details about the measure. And John Michael will discuss the history of transportation planning in Austin and the history leading up to Proposition A and its approval by the Austin City Council earlier this summer, as well as cover some of the additional elements in the measure. As a reminder and disclaimer, ENO doesn't support or endorse specific ballot measures or legislation going on around the country. And the focus of these webinars is to talk through the history and details of these measures and understand how regions across the country have handled ballot measures and potential new capital investments during the pandemic. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and you can submit those as always on the questions box on the side of your screen on the control panel. And we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. And with that, I will hand it over to John Michael.
Thanks, Ramik. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about Proposition A, Project Connect, and just what's happening with transit in Austin. Also really good to see you. We miss you and can't wait after you conquer Washington to get you back home to Austin. And really appreciate this opportunity again. So I thought, before turning it over to Dave, who's going to talk about the system plan that you see before you and the proposition, to kind of give you a little bit of context of at a very high level how we got to this place in Austin. So Capital Metro is our regional public transportation agency. It was founded by referendum. Austin and other surrounding communities voted it into existence in the mid-1980s, and it was funded by 1-cent sales tax collected in the service area, took over the city of Austin's bus service, assumed that service, and has been growing its bus service ever since. The next major milestone that's related that I'd mention is in 2000, Capital Metro put before voters a proposition that would have funded a pretty significant and comprehensive at the time light rail system serving the core and other parts of Austin. And it was a big election in the year 2000 and a very fateful moment for our city. We just missed passing that particular referendum. I think it failed by less than 2,000 votes, looking at the turnout and the votes for it, it was a proposition that passed with a significant majority within the city of Austin, but it was kind of the outlying areas, the more suburban areas of Austin and some of the surrounding communities, the bedroom communities that were part of the Capital Metro service area, where it really did poorly and dragged the thing down. But again, it was just so close. I would just mention, because it may come up later, some of the folks who were lead in the campaign against that particular referendum in 2000, folks like Travis County Commissioner Gerald Doherty, and who's at this point our lone Republican elected official in Travis County, and other folks, the more conservative bent in Travis County, which tends to be a little bit more progressive than the rest of Texas, were the leads in the opposition. And I mention that because as we get to some of these other milestones, we find it's kind of the same people on the other side of these things. That was also a lesson learned in that election. It was not a really good election for this particular type of measure. It was the election where our then Governor Ann Richards was defeated by the Governor George W. Bush at that time. 2004, we had another referendum that Capital Metro put in front of the community after it kind of came back and looked at how we could put something else forward. It developed a comprehensive plan called All Systems Go, which included bus rapid transit elements, new park and rides, express bus service, and then commuter rail service called the Metro Rail Red Line, and some future concepts that hadn't really been fleshed out for some streetcar circulators, et cetera. The measure was really authorization for Capital Metro to take an existing freight rail line and convert it over to commuter rail, which is now the Red Line. That was successful, passing with well over 60% of the vote in 2004. One of the interesting things to note about that is there was no, it was a request for Capital Metro to have authorization to do it. It wasn't a request for bonds or new taxes. The sales tax, which had accumulated over time for Capital Metro, was mainly used for the capital construction costs of the Red Line. So it was a campaign where they could promise no new taxes, no new additional taxes, which probably helped it be successful, not just in Austin, but in those surrounding communities that tended to vote against those kinds of measures. Another kind of fateful moment while Capital Metro was in the midst of that capital program, not only building the Metro Rail Red Line, but also building many of those new park and rides and expanding service, was the Great Recession in 2008. Capital Metro, around 75–80% at the time of Capital Metro's revenue came from that 1 cent sales tax collected in a service area. And like many other communities, our sales tax plummeted, leaving Capital Metro in a pretty precarious financial state. Another lesson learned from that is that sales tax may not be the best, most reliable, most resilient funding source for a long capital construction program. So and a lot of these lessons learned kind of built up to get us to this point. But after 2008, around 2010 is when finally, and after a few hiccups, the Metro Rail Red Line service commenced. And just as an aside, that's a little bit before that is around the time that I got to Capital Metro. And one observation I'll make that will become relevant when Dave kind of talks about the journey of creating this Project Connect system plan was, at the time, for a variety of reasons, the relationship between the city of Austin and Capital Metro, which is a separate quasi-governmental agency, was not really that constructive. It's often combative. It was not as collaborative as it really needed to be. And that created a lot of challenges for planning for transportation in the region. And I think that, and just as a, previewing some of the things Dave will talk about, one of the major factors, I think, in the success that we've had over the last few years has been the rehabilitation of that relationship between the city and the transit authority. They're now working hand in glove and is really key to what got us here. Fast forward a little bit to 2014, there was an initial Project Connect system planning process looking at the entire region. And the first project to kind of shoot out from that regional system planning process, kind of what I would call Project Connect 1.0, was a proposal that was put in front of voters, not by Capital Metro per se, but by the city of Austin, because it was a bond proposition. Capital Metro doesn't have the legal authority to sell bonds. It was a bond proposition to pay for the local capital costs of construction for a starter light rail line, one line that would have been part of a bigger system that wasn't as well defined yet, as well fleshed out. We took that to the voters in 2014. Also of note on that same ballot was a transition from the City of Austin City Council's long-standing form of at-large representation, which has 7 council members who are elected citywide, to a 10-1 single-member district with 1 at-large mayor form of government. Was also on the ballot. That ended up being a much lower turnout election than I think anybody anticipated, and wasn't really a positive election for measures like this, especially in Austin. And that referendum went down pretty hard, and we all were kind of left licking our wounds and figuring out, okay, what do we do next? Past there, one other thing to note, because of some of the issues that came up in that referendum when people saw the project, there was a lot of focus and attention on that one particular line that was proposed, and people felt like, well, it doesn't serve me. It doesn't go to where I live. It doesn't go to where I work. It doesn't make sense to them. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't serve all parts of the city. It didn't make sense to a lot of people. Even our very active and loud transit advocacy community, which was growing at the time, kind of scratched their heads and really didn't understand why we would propose that particular corridor instead of other corridors that could have been considered. And we ended up having a significant portion of our transit advocate community suggesting that and advocating for the failure of that referendum and saying, well, they'll bring back something better later. So it was a tough election for us, but again, lots of lessons learned. Flash forward to 2016. We, in the mayor's office, working with the council and the community, kind of taking some of the lessons learned from some of those previous elections, proposed a comprehensive multimodal transportation initiative with a focus on some of our biggest arterial corridors in the city, active transportation, improving those corridors for other modes, including transit. Not really a direct investment in transit itself because we really didn't have a plan or a project teed up, but preparing, laying the groundwork for a more walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly community. One of the lessons learned was the public really, from previous elections, is that the public really didn't want us to think small. They were fed up with our transportation challenges. They saw Austin growing rapidly. We've been the fastest growing metro region for many, many years now. Our population doubles every 20 years. People felt, they wanted us to do something big and meaningful. And so we took that gamble and we proposed a transportation bond that was $720 million, which was not only the largest we've ever done, it was larger than the previous 20 years cumulatively of all the transportation measures that have been put out in front of the community. That was very successful, passed with about 60% of the electorate. It was also a very high turnout election in Travis County for a variety of reasons. But again, it was a lot of lessons learned there, that the public wanted something that served that made sense to them, that they could see a map with projects all over the city and it made sense to them. Right after that, the city of Austin initiated a revisit of our strategic mobility plans. We initiated a planning process citywide that eventually resulted in a new strategic mobility plan for our city that looked at all modes of travel, looked at our street network, and set many goals for our city, but chiefly among them was over the next 20 years that we want to get to a 50 mode share in our city, with 50% residents commuting by some other means other than a single occupant vehicle. Right now, we're at about 75% of our city commuting in single occupancy vehicles, so we've got some work to do. That plan relies on transit to carry a heavy load of that mode shift, because over that same planning horizon, our population will double again, going from a region of 2 million people to about 4 million people. And while we were going through the comprehensive community planning effort for our strategic mobility plan, Capital Metro relaunched the kind of Project Connect 2.0 system planning process. And again, working very closely with the city. And here's where I think it'll make sense for me to turn it over to Dave to talk about those efforts.
Thank you, John Michael. Building on what John Michael was just saying, we started in earnest in August of 2018 with the first of what had been a series of really unique meetings. It was a joint meeting that was the City Council and the Capital Metro Board. It, in actuality, was the first of 9 joint meetings, which is something that I haven't seen in other areas of the country that I've worked. And it really speaks to the collaboration and the partnership that has been developed between the city and Capital Metro. In that first few months, in November of 2018, we rolled out the first draft system plan. And that was a point that it took it to a regional basis. It gave everything from having park and rides and express service out in the suburbs to building on what was there for the existing red line, commuter line, and introducing a whole series of other alternatives. And we started through that process, and as we went through it, what we got to was the utilization and that joint working together continuing when the ASMP, the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan that John Michael was talking about, was passed in April of the following year. So as we went ahead and moved forward, it was lockstep, all together, even at that super executive level, the political level, the electeds, the board and city council, all working very closely together to get us to that point. As we went forward from there, we wound up with having a public involvement process. We've learned from other efforts around the country that this really has to become the public's plan. And as we went through that outreach through a series of mainly in-person meetings in the beginning, we had the involvement of over 60,000 individuals. We had groups that were there from different neighborhoods. We had participation of the other agencies around the area so that we were being inclusive as opposed to doing something that was coming out that was going to be the plan. It was looking for that public participation and that public involvement. It took a twist with the coronavirus. No longer were we able to go ahead and have those in-person meetings. No longer were we able to do things that were putting groups out on a weekend at the supermarket or at the local festival. We then were forced to pivot. And what we pivoted to was things that were a combination of Teams and Zoom and other platforms to be able to get the message across. Between the time that we started that process in the April and May timeframe and moving up to the middle of August, we had engaged some 17,000 individuals, which really with that kind of a shift to a totally different approach was really amazing that we got that kind and level of participation. But as we went ahead and went forward with it, we then came up with what the approved system plan was going to be. And with that, a series of locally preferred alternatives. And that occurred on June the 10th of this year. So I'd like to go ahead at this point and walk you through what is there in the overall system plan. And then I'll point out as we go forward that we've got the overall system plan that is that regional plan, that is that ultimate build out over time. But what we're going forward with right now and what John Michael will talk about that is part of Proposition A on the ballot a week and a half from now is an initial investment that starts a portion of the system with a value of some $7.1 billion. So I'll go ahead and walk through what the overall plan is. And then as I go through it, I'll identify the parts that are going to be included in the initial investment and then those that will come later. So I'll start with the area, the regional area. We have a series of park and rides and express service that we now provide around the region. This plan adds a series of those up to ultimately 9 different routes with 24 park and rides. The initial plan has got 3 additional routes and 9, so they are in areas that are less accessible, if you will, to the downtown core. So that's the outside feeder portion. In addition, the longer commute sections are the red line that went into operation that goes from Leander at the northwest into downtown, immediately adjacent to the downtown convention center. So that line has been in existence, and as part of what we're doing with Project Connect, there are enhancements. It's basically been a single track railroad. It is in the right-of-way that was previously a freight railroad that Capital Metro owns. So there have been a series of things that have done that puts passing tracks in and sidings in some locations. But we've been able to get to a point that is about a 20-minute frequency. Under this project and Project Connect, we're adding more sidings, more passing tracks. So we'll be able to go ahead and get to a 15-minute frequency. In addition to that, we've got a development that is going to install a new station. It's a public-private partnership that'll be a new development at Broadmoor. And we're working closely with the new soccer stadium to go ahead and get a station located at the soccer stadium. So those are the enhancements that are there that we're including, and as we go forward to provide better service on the red line, the commuter line. The other commuter line that is there, and again, that will be in the right-of-way that Capital Metro also owns, and it's the green line that goes up to the northeast. The initial segment of that would go to a section that's called Colony Park. And then in the future, with the full system build out, it could go well beyond that up to an area that is in the Elgin area of the far northeast portion. So in that initial investment is that first segment that goes from Colony Park into an area adjacent to the convention center where the Red Line terminus is. We just opened this past Monday a new station adjacent to the convention center, which gives us a much higher capacity, additional tracks and new platforms to be able to accommodate the additional ridership that we're anticipating, not only the red line, but also in the future, the green line. The next piece that's there is really going to the high capacity portions. And these were ones that were included individually in the previous referendums that John Michael was talking about. The main core, the main spine of the system is the orange line. It's a north-south line that goes from Tech Ridge at the very far north down to Slaughter at the southern end. It's about a 20-mile long line that will be light rail. And the initial investment will go ahead and be from the Lamar Transit Center, which is about 5 miles short of the northern terminus, down to an area just north of Slaughter at Stastny. So it will be that main core that will be part of the initial investment. For that same line, we currently have what we call Metro Rapid, which is a service that runs on a 10-minute frequency and has limited stops. So that'll continue until we're able to go ahead and expand the orange line to its full length out and into the future. The other high capacity line is the blue line. That comes in from the Austin airport. It's the east-west line. It goes over the lake and again up past the convention center to a station that then will be a place that it will be the combination of the red line and the green line commuter lines. It also will have the blue line, and then out into the future it will have the gold line that I'll talk about in a minute. But the blue line then goes across downtown and connects into the orange line. So it allows us at that point, because we will go ahead and have the infrastructure, the guideway and all the other components in place to interline the blue and the orange line, basically from Republic Square, which is the heart and the center of downtown, up to the North Lamar Transit Center, which gives us the ability for individually having a 10-minute frequency, for example, in from the airport, but in that core portion to be able to go ahead and cut to a 5-minute frequency, providing much better service. The other high capacity line is the gold line. It runs basically from ACC Highland parallel to the orange line, down also to the convention center and across to Republic Square. That's the ultimate build out, is to go to light rail. And as part of the initial investment, that portion will start out basically as bus rapid transit, what we've named Metro Rapid. So that will give that ability in the future to go ahead and do the conversion, to be able to go over to light rail as time passes and as funding is identified. Along with each one of those, and going back to Metro Rapid and the way that it is at the ends of the orange line, we have another series of those lines, and those are, some of them you can see on this image. They're really the ones that show up in purple. There are several of them that are east-west. The Palmer line is at the very top of the map. There are a couple across downtown, and then there's several that go off to the east, to the right side, and also on the left side up to the northwest and the southwest. We currently have got the line that comes in from the northwest that has been in service since 2016. That is the companion to what we have for the orange line. And that runs from that northwest section down into downtown and then out to the southwest. As part of Project Connect, we'll be extending that line at the southwest corner down from the transit center down Mancheca and also out to Oak Hill. So it's about a 5-mile extension for each one of those. Off to the right, really at about 3 o'clock on the map that you're looking at, is another line called the Expo line. It starts at the Expo Pavilion and weaves through and comes into downtown. That also will come down and be at the convention center. The next line that we have, because we have 3 of them of the 7 that are included within the initial investment, the next one is the Pleasant Valley line. That's a north-south line that runs basically from the downtown area down to new developments that are down in the southeast to McKinney Falls and other locations. And each one of those 3 that are included in the program will have that Metro Rapid service, the 10-minute frequency, the distance between the stops, to be able to go ahead and get into downtown. There'll be things like traffic priority, all of those components that allow for that better and expanded service. So those are the main pieces of it, but we're also using something that's different, something that's there and evolving in the industry, and we're using neighborhood circulators. Which is, instead of using 40-foot buses in areas where there is limited ridership, going with a much smaller vehicle. It really is an on-call service within the neighborhood. So it's pick up people at their homes, take them within the designated area, either to the store or to the doctors or to the hospital, or transfer to a higher capacity system. So each one of those areas, and we've rolled out 6 of them so far, and they're being very, very, very successful. The utilization of those compared to what was there when we were running the 40-foot buses, it's exponential with what's there for the ridership. So there's a total of 15 of those that are within the overall system. In addition, we're going to have a new fare system, something that will go ahead goal-wise to be one unified system that will be there for all of the transit in the region. One of the things that makes the downtown better and that provides better efficiency for the blue line and also for the orange line is a downtown tunnel. That is something that would run from the lake up to the convention center, across the heart of downtown on 4th Street, and then go north and south on the orange line until we could go ahead and get out of that main core of the city. It eliminates interferences, it eliminates interfaces that are there, whether it's taxis or in Austin, scooters and pedestrians crossing intersections. It makes it more of a very, very efficient system and able to operate in a much better fashion so that we're providing better and more frequent service. By doing that, we avoid about 20% of what the traffic signals are that are on the street network. And we've got that separate and distinct, isolated, if you will, area of the system that isn't dependent upon anything that is going on the surface. But what it really comes down to is its total system. It's something that gives that regional approach. It is something that when it was approved on June the 10th of this year, we were then able to go ahead at the same time and come up with locally preferred alternatives. So we have got a locally preferred alternative for the high capacity lines, the blue and the orange line. We're in the process over the next month or so to go ahead and start the full environmental process. We've also got, looking to the future, the gold line that would be eventually into the light rail. And we've already started the federal process on the 3 Metro Rapid lines, Expo, Pleasant Valley, and the extension of the 801 down to Mancheca and Oak Hill. We went ahead and got into the project development in the month of August. And put on our first series of ratings to go ahead to be evaluated, included within the FTA annual report that is published every year. So those are the steps that we've taken. And as we prepare and we go ahead and look forward to the next couple of weeks, we're planning for the future. We're planning on going ahead and moving forward with what we've already started on several of the lines, early scoping on orange and on blue, so that we can progress the program as quickly as we can to develop that needed transit system for Austin and for the region. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to John Michael.
Great. Well, I know we're about to start questions, but I'll just say where we kind of pick it up from there quickly in the development of Proposition A. As the Capital Metro Board and the City Council, we're deliberating on the system plan and mode selection. Do we do a tunnel? Do we not do a tunnel? Are we serving the right corridors? All of that. There was a community effort that was organized by the mayor, also our state senator and other key stakeholders, a nonprofit education concern called Transit for Austin, which really served as a great sounding board, advising our policymakers, kind of keeping the pulse of the community on some of the big issues that would be before the policymakers as they decided how to move forward. So we have this great system plan that's part of our overall and a key piece of the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. So what should we do to implement? So some of the things that were before them was how much of this do we bite off, right? Do we try to fund the whole $10 billion worth, or do we try to find a way to fund kind of an initial investment? The advice we got after talking to people was we should break off enough that it's meaningful. Again, we're trying to balance with what we've learned from other elections, that the community wants us to do something big enough that they actually believe it will work. So we learned that lesson in this initial investment. I think one way that I've heard Dave and others characterize it before, we get about 75% of the benefit, or it's actually more than that of the benefit for about 75% of the cost. So it's really the key, the big workhorse parts of the system. Then it was, how do we pay for this? Our standard way of doing these capital programs is with a bond proposition that would be paid back with our INS tax rate. But what we've come to learn is that, well, that's not necessarily the best way to fund something like this in a long capital program like this. And Capital Metro's 1 penny sales tax not enough to pay for the maintenance and operation to run this thing. We need to have that ongoing revenue stream to actually operate and maintain and keep a state of good repair over time. So they evaluated different options. Where we landed on was not a bond, but was with a tax rate election, raising the city of Austin's property tax rate, which, going back to lessons learned, is a much more stable and resilient source of revenue that grows pretty consistently over time and brings in enough revenue to be able to fund something like this, not only the capital costs, but the ongoing maintenance operation, state of good repair. And when we crunch the numbers, it actually ends up being cheaper on the capital side because we can accumulate some of that property tax revenue and cash finance some of it rather than just doing everything with debt. So it ended up being a good way to go for us from a fiscal prudence point of view. The other decision that was before the policymakers was, what else do we fund in addition to the transit? We had advocates that were asking for additional investments in active transportation, But where the council ended up landing, another issue that's emerged in the city over the last couple of decades, as it has in other cities, is a growing affordability challenge, a growing challenge with economic segregation, a growing challenge as people flock to the central city for more urban living, is a growing displacement of existing communities, and especially low income and communities of color. So what we heard from the community is they did not want us embarking on a system like this that was only going to throw gasoline on the fire of the challenges that we're already facing with affordability and gentrification and displacement. So where we ended up landing is, instead of making, as part of this proposition, additional investments in active transportation on a grand scale, was, we think, kind of unique, certainly at this scale, was over the course of this program, we're dedicating $300 million for affordability and anti-displacement strategies around the station areas, so that when we went out into the community, especially our lower income and our communities of color, we could say we're building this to benefit you in these communities and not displace you. We want the folks that are actually here to be able to benefit from this in the long run. So we're really excited about that, and I'm happy to give more details on that. So where we ended up, sorry, Ramik, I know we're getting into QA. Another thing that was big, what we heard from our stakeholders, is they wanted this to not necessarily be a Capital Metro program or a City of Austin program. They wanted some independent oversight. They wanted to depoliticize the implementation of this. So what Capital Metro and the City Council decided to do was get into a contract with the voters that commits us to forming a separate local government corporation that will braid this new tax revenue, some contribution of Capital Metro sales tax dollars, what we anticipate is a lot of capital funding from the FTA, into one body that would be responsible for not setting policy, but for the implementation of this program over time. So Proposition A is an 8 3/4 cent property tax rate increase for City of Austin that would fund, provide a revenue stream to fund the capital side, operations, maintenance, state of good repair for this initial $7+ billion initial investment in the overall system, $300 million of anti-displacement funding, and a commitment to set up this separate local government corporation to oversee it all that we're calling the Austin Transit Partnership. A lot more in there too, or context around it, but I better get to your questions before Ramik mutes me.
All good. There's a ton in this measure, so a lot of detail to cover. We've got a couple of questions to talk about the funding in more detail, as well as some questions about the negotiations leading up to council approval and the pandemic. So I'll start off with some of the funding questions. A couple of attendees have asked, the share of federal funding that's anticipated for this project, whether there's going to be a role for FTA, and others have asked whether Cap Metro sees any appetite or potential for a P3 element of any of these investments.
Let me take that one. The projection that we've got right now for the two major projects, the orange and the blue, is under the FTA New Starts program. What currently is running around the nation is in the mid-40s. So we've anticipated a 45% share on the two major items. When you look at the Metro Rapid lines that come under the Small Starts program, that by definition are less than $300 million, we're looking at probably about a 50% share on those. And that ties into what we're seeing in other areas around the country.
Yeah, and I would just say, one of the unfortunate things is we're probably a good 20 or 30 years behind on these kinds of infrastructure investments in our city. But the silver lining of that is our problems here are so immense. We're probably going to rate pretty high in that FTA process because we're just so far behind, and the investments that are necessary, looking at the way the projects are rated, I think we're going to be very, very competitive because of, quite frankly, our failure to invest at the scale over the last couple of decades.
And another part of the question about the oh, go ahead, David.
Let me kind of back up to the second half of that question. The triple P, yes, there are options that are going to be there. We just started our first one, which is the Broadmoor project that I talked about a little bit earlier. But as we start to go ahead and go into the future, whether it's on the Green Line with areas that are stations, whether there are other things that come up along the Metro Rapid, yes, we're very open and desirous to go ahead and go into those. It's also a focus that FTA has had over the last few years, the desire for that participation. So it's something that we believe that we can build on. We think it's something that will also help us as we go forward with the approach to the federal funding from FTA.
Got it. Some of the other questions we've gotten to about, when we talk about the council negotiations and some of the other elements of this project, both people interested in, how the pandemic factored into this measure, but also, when the council was weighing in on the, the anti-displacement measures, to what level of detail can you, dive into what some of those anti-displacement measures are going to look like, and, council's role in setting some of those priorities?
Yeah. So with respect to the pandemic, I do think it had an impact in the council's deliberations, but that separate community effort, the Transit for Austin group, one of the ways that it advised the policymakers was by doing research, surveys of the community, trying to ascertain, because we were right in the midst of the pandemic, and the stay-at-home orders, et cetera. And of course, there was a lot of trepidation. Should we even be doing this during a pandemic? Is the community going to say, well, yeah, I really want that. I'd normally be for it, but there's all this uncertainty economically, with the pandemic. And what the research indicated, kind of shockingly to us at first, is that no, the public was still very optimistic. They felt like that the city should, even during a pandemic, be making these kinds of investments in our future. What we also learned is, and this is, I think, a great thing just generally, is that the public started to become much more aware and appreciative of the role of essential workers in our economy. And when we talk to them about how essential workers disproportionately rely on transit to get to those jobs at the grocery store and in the healthcare facilities that keep us going during these times, it was a value that they saw. The other thing that was happening along with the pandemic, of course, was all of the social justice conversation, the policing conversation that we've been having in cities around the country, and a broader ongoing conversation about social and racial justice. And when we talked about how this investment, this system will disproportionately benefit communities of color and low-income communities in our city, it became something that was of even greater value to the community, even during the pandemic. So I think what influenced much of the council's thinking was really the conversation about how big of a bite do we take? Do we go for the whole 10 billion, or do we try to moderate it down to that $7.5 billion initial investment? And that's where they landed. So I think it did have an impact, but they still felt very confident about moving forward. But I think that probably also shaped the conversation about including that anti-displacement money as part of this, to be responsive to what the community was feeling at this time. And as far as details, there really aren't any, because, and that's intentional, the other thing we heard from the community is they did not want a top-down approach. Every community is different. And what they wanted a commitment to was having these resources available and to be deployed after working closely with those individual neighborhoods, those station areas, to figure out what anti-displacement strategies made the most sense there. In some places, it may be land acquisition, for development of future affordable housing. It could be providing people with legal services, clear up a title or to make sure that ownership can be transferred. It could be home repair. It could be rental subsidies. It could be any number of things that will be developed as a strategy unique to each one of those communities in partnership with the community. The one thing the council did commit to, among other things in the related to this in the contract with the voters, was the development of actually two things. A community advisory group that would advise the policymakers on the deployment of that money, and then some dashboards of metrics that will be developed so that we can all monitor together how well we're doing in deploying that money effectively.
Got it. And I know we're a little over time, but just want to get to one more question before we sign off. Back to the funding point, we had some people ask, to what level of planning or design are some of these initial investments in, both in terms of whether that initial investment is going to cover, some of these projects. I know some of them are being implemented later than others, but I think folks are curious in what level of detail the initial investment has been planned out to.
As we start to go through what we've developed as a sequence for the program, the early projects will really be the ones that I'll just say that the rubber tire projects, because they're quicker to go ahead and roll out. So that will be the Metro Rapid, it will be the Express, it will be the neighborhood circulators, and they all come out over the first 2 or 3 years. At that same time frame, with utilizing the Federal Transit Administration's NEPA process, we're going to be in that process for basically the next 2 years. And when we get through with that, we will also be at a decision point because we'll have a 30% design. And at that point, we can make decisions on whether we should go with which type of contract. Do we do things that are design build that utilizes what we have? Do we do things that are conventional design bid build? Those are the decisions that are out there a couple of years down the road. So it's a very sequential step program, but it does take, as you go through light rail, a series of time to get through the environmental, the engineering, and then it's where do you get the rail cars, and that's normally about a 5-year cycle. So as we go forward, we're looking at something on the light rail of about that 8-year time frame to be able to get it up and running in service. And as we go forward, we'll see how the funding comes, where we are, how we do things. But ultimately, the intention is to build out the entire system with just the initial investment going now.
Got it. And that worked out well. I had a question about delivery methods. And so I think folks will be able to stay tuned and see how those contracting processes pan out. Well, I know we're a little bit over time and we've covered a ton of ground. So I want to thank John Michael and David again for joining us and talking through this measure in such great detail. If there are any specific questions that we didn't get to, we'll be able to follow up separately afterwards. And as usual, we will have a recording of this webinar on our website in the next day or two. And so thank you everyone for joining us. Check our event page for up and coming webinars over the next couple of weeks. And we hope everyone takes care and continues to stay safe. Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
See ya.